Well, hello and welcome to episode 21 of You with Jesus. During COVID, as well as wearing face masks, we were given all sorts of rules and instructions about how to sneeze responsibly and how to wash our hands. Even now, I go into public bathrooms and above the sink, there's a visual guide on how to wash my hands. Step 1, turn on the tap. Step 2, push the liquid soap dispenser onto my hands. Step 3, rub my hands together for 20 seconds. My friend even wrote a song that went a little bit viral, all about washing your hands.
I'm gonna wash my hands and have some fun. Soap and water until those 20 seconds are done. I'm gonna sploosh, splosh, splish, splash, sploosh, splosh, splish, splash, woo!
I'm not a fan of all the rules that were enforced at that time, but I do appreciate the need for them, and I suppose it was good to be reminded about how to wash my hands properly. Truth is, I'm just not very good with rules. So you can imagine that I'm kind of glad that I wasn't a young Jewish kid growing up at first century Palestine. So many rules about washing, good rules that might have once been about proper sanitization, were just some of the hundreds of rules that have been introduced by the Jewish rabbis. And this is where we need to make a distinction. There was the law given by God through Moses to the Israelites. This was known as Torah, and it was all written down and forms the first 5 books of the Bible. And in addition to this was an extensive oral law tradition. This oral law was formed by rabbis trying to figure out how the written law should be applied in each and every specific situation. These interpretations and applications were called midrash, and there were literally hundreds of these oral laws. The oral law, which focused on interpretation and application, had become as authoritative as the written law found in the Torah. But this oral law was very, very detailed and covered every minutiae of life to the point that it had become a burden for the people. And part of the job of the rabbis was to ensure that these oral laws were obeyed to the nth degree. Jesus' objection to the oral law was this, that most of it was simply based on traditions of men. It was man-made and had not been given by God. As far as Jesus was concerned, much of this cumbersome oral tradition was actually getting in the way of worshipping God. The basic commands of loving God and loving others have been completely submerged and overwhelmed by the hundreds and hundreds of things that religious people were either required to do or not do. And a lot of these laws concern purification laws and ritual laws around the practice of washing. Because if you didn't wash properly, if you were unclean and you came into contact with someone who was clean, then they became unclean. Which brings us to the jars used for ceremonial washing found at the wedding where Jesus turned the water into wine. They were stone jars as opposed to clay jars. The issue with clay jars was if something unclean went into them, then the whole jar had to be smashed to pieces, whereas stone jars just needed to be empty of whatever it was that had made them unclean so that they could be reused over and over again. We don't know for sure why the stone jars were at this house. It could have been that the owner of the property had a quarry nearby and part of his trade involved making the jars. It could have been it was the home of a rabbi, or at least someone very religious or wealthy whose family did a lot of purifying. They would be filled with water and water would be drawn from the jar for the purposes of ceremonial washing. But as I mentioned, Jesus and his disciples ignored the oral law that said you needed to wash yourself all the time. Let's look at a story from the Gospel of Mark. The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they first give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and they observe many other traditions such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with defiled hands?" He replied, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it is written, these people honour me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions." And he continued, "You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them, for it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach, and then out of their body?" In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. Now, think about it. Jesus takes a vessel at the wedding, a stone ceremonial jar that represents the traditions that had been passed down. It represents all the regulations in regard to ceremonial washing. He takes those vessels, has them filled with water, and then transmutes the water from those vessels into wine. And not just your regular Shiraz, but hundreds of litres of Penfold Grange Hermitage. John speaks of this miracle as a sign, and it is a sign that the new age that had been prophesied in the Old Testament was now dawning in Jesus. Here's just a few of those Old Testament prophecies. On this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and the finest of wines. They will come and shout for joy on the heights of Zion. They will rejoice in the bounty of the Lord, the grain, the new wine, and the olive oil, the young of the flocks and herds. They will be like a well-watered garden, and they will sorrow no more. In that day, the mountains will drip with new wine, and the hills will flow with milk. All the ravines of Judah will run with water. A fountain will flow out of the Lord's house and will water the valley of Acacias. It's this image of wonderful abundance and blessing. It is the promise of a wine that is better than what preceded it. It wasn't that the law of Moses was bad. The wine the guests were drinking wasn't bad, but it's symbolic that this age of the Spirit, inaugurated by Jesus, is far better. When you think of religion, what comes into your mind? For many people, it's about certain rules and regulations that must be followed. Many of those rules and regulations are often based on traditions and have nothing to do with true Christianity. When I was a child, I wasn't allowed to go to the beach on a Sunday. Now, to this day, I still can't see what actual religious purpose that rule served. Did it help me love God more or love my neighbour more? No. Rules, particularly religious rules, are burdensome. You experts in the law, woe to you, because you load people down with burdens they can hardly carry, and you yourselves will not lift one finger to help them. That's Jesus' words to the Pharisees. How is what Jesus offers different to that? Listen to his words. "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened," many burdened by religious rules, "and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Jesus gives a beautiful invitation here to come, not to a belief system, not to a set of hundreds of laws about what you can and can't do, but as an invitation to come to him, and he will give you rest for your soul. The prophet Isaiah expresses it like this: "Come, all you who are thirsty, come to the waters, and you who have no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without cost." Why spend money on what is not bread, and your labour on what does not satisfy? Listen to me and eat what is good, and you will delight in the richest of fare. Give ear and come to me. Listen that you may live. Let's come. See you in the next episode.